And Mexico has deeply changed. Mexico has grown as an economy. It has gone through a demographic transition, so there are much fewer Mexicans who would be willing to come. In fact, immigration from Mexico since 2010 has flattened and has actually become negative. In the last 5 years, every year, we have lost about 100,000 Mexican immigrants in net. More people have gone back than they have come to the US.
You know, the word deportation has become kind of a trigger in our country these days. There are those who think we don't do enough of it. There are those who think we do too much of it. The numbers don't lie, though, and the numbers tell a very specific story. We are so lucky to have Giovanni Peri with us today to walk us through those numbers. Stay tuned. Let's just jump right in here.
Yes.
You work a lot in deportation and not deporting people, but reporting on the facts and figures around it. That word, deportation, these days is a trigger, really, for a lot of people on either side of the aisle. Some people think we're not doing enough of it. Some people think we're doing too much. But the data actually tells a very specific story, right? Can you expound on what you're learning about deportation?
Yes. Each person who's deported has a personal story, which is very important. But there is also a story which is told by the aggregate numbers. One thing that we need to say right up front is that deporting immigrants is not a new thing in the United States. It has been done at different waves in different time of history. But now it looks like the current administration is ramping up the number of people who are deported significantly. So just to give some numbers, some current numbers, it looks like there have been about 220,000 deported people since the beginning of the administration, which is a large number. More alarmingly, there are also data on the decline of foreign-born, of immigrants in general, which has been much larger than just the deported people. There seems to be a drop in 1.3, 1.4 million of immigrants. In the past, there have been periods of large deportation, and I have studied the consequences, mainly the economic consequences of that. So this number tells the story of what happens to the U.S. Local communities, states, aggregate economy when we have deported large numbers of people.
So, and you touched on quite a few things during that intro, which thank you for that, by the way. One of the things I really want to touch on is that these are personal stories. Like we look at these things from the macro and say the numbers, the trends are this way, but each one of these instances is a human being that has a story. Is there, I know data can't really tell you a fairness, but is the perception of unfairness what's driving that? So 200,000 people being deported, then you said it was like close to like 1.4 million in total loss of an immigrant population. Is it driven by the fear of what they see happening to these people? Do they see it as a persecution?
So part of it is, so the total decline in immigration is actually several parts. A group of people have been deported. Several more have left the U.S. Because of fear, because of uneasiness in this environment. Many people have not come or have not renewed visa. By the way, that number includes both people who didn't have documentation and people who had documentation. So even a lot of people who could have come documented didn't, and some people left. You're right that even focusing on the deportees, the 220,000, those are a lot of personal stories. And the profile of people who are deported, although it's very early, but looking at the profile of people who were undocumented in the US, many of them are people who have been in the US for 10, 15, 20 years. Many of them have worked for 10, 15, 20 years. Many of them are really well integrated in the local community with children who are born in the US, therefore US citizen. So you are really affecting a group that has deep consequences on their family, but potentially also on their local community and on the local economies. So the individual story are used to be told, is useful to tell the individual stories, and then in aggregate the consequences also depend on how many and who are you deporting.
And toward that end, toward that aggregated figure, this is a cycle, or not a cycle, but it's not. This is not the first time that we've seen major deportations in the country. Can you talk a little bit about what historically has happened and what were the implications for the U.S. economy and spirit overall?
Yes, so one of the study that I have with the two co-authors looks in depth to the deportation of 1929-1930. So this is back the United States were at the beginning of the Great Depression, and a lot of Mexican immigrants at the time were doing a lot of the jobs in agriculture, in services, in manufacturing, as they are right now. But because the economy was going into deep recession, the authority back then thought that by deporting a large number of Mexicans, they would have freed up jobs for Americans that needed them. So the whole operation ended up causing the between 500,000 Mexicans to leave the U.S. Some of them individually deported, more of them encouraged to go back or pushed or forced to go back. And it's interesting because very often the motivation for this deportation is we will deport them and Americans will have jobs. So we looked at exactly what happened to the local economy where a lot of these people were deported. And we look mainly at the U.S. states near the Mexican border, which were the one which had more Mexican workers. And we use the fact that while some community really aggressively and more actively deported, others deported less, so there is a big variation in how many Mexican one local economy lost. And what we find is that in the 5, 10, 15 years after this deportation, so looking at 1940, 1945, 1950, the consequences were that the local economy where more Mexican were deported, actually were local economy where the overall employment decreased, the employment of US-born worker, especially lower educated, decreased, and their wages and their type of job decreased. Intuitively, by losing this big mass of workers and company not being able to operate because construction company, agricultural company, manufacturing lost a lot of Mexicans, the American who were not really doing the same job. Some of them were forced to take these lower level jobs, so they were downgraded to jobs that paid less. And many companies didn't have the right mix of worker to continue to work. And so they closed, they disappeared. And so many jobs that were taken by Americans also disappeared. So the effect was almost the opposite of what the administration was saying. And the local community had a reduction in employment, lowering in wages, and fewer firms and companies operating in those communities.
And then that's happened subsequently too, like World War II, Japanese internment, another variation of that. Did we see similar outcome of that, where we, at the end of it, we just saw a net smaller workforce?
That's part of the story. Each one of these episodes has a little bit different consequences depending on what type of jobs and what type of workers were the people targeted by this. In the World War II Japanese internment, there was a deportation to internal camps, really, which affected 200,000 Japanese, mostly on the West Coast. The consequence of that, because these Japanese, many of them, were very highly skilled agricultural and farmers who were bringing to the Western agriculture in the US new technology, new innovations which were making them more productive. The loss of this population generated a big loss in agricultural value and agricultural productivity in those counties that lost these Japanese. In that case, just to add a little interesting fact, we have almost a very clear natural experiment in evaluating the effect, because Japanese were deported only in those counties which were west to a line that was established by the Western Command that decided that if Japanese were in that area, they would have been dangerous. So we have a few counties really next to each other. Some had all the Japanese deported, other didn't have it because they were east to this line. And we can follow how these counties did in terms of agricultural productivity, value of agriculture, technology adopted in agriculture, and wage, and then overall population and employment growth in the local economy. And we find that the effect of a typical county is that if you lost Japanese by 1% of your population, so if you had a number of Japanese equal to 1% of your population which was deported, 15 years later your agricultural productivity would have been 12% lower than it would have been without. So very big important effect due to this important skilled role that Japanese played in that time in agriculture.
So having seen this in history happen historically and seeing similar outcomes, why are we here now? What are you hearing about the rationale behind this movement to deport?
The rationale is always that either there is a danger from this group or there is an economic damage from this group. And Mexicans were taking jobs back in 1929, and apparently they're taking jobs now, according to the politician who decided that Japanese were dangerous back then, and now criminals are now. It's interesting, again, I have another study that looked at more recent the effect of deportation in 2012. There was another increase in deportation in the 2006-2012 period. And there I look at whether deporting more people reduced the local crime, if it had an effect on the other side that is always mentioned. These people are dangerous, they need to be deported. And there, not only I don't find that those increased deportation in the 2008-2012 decreased crime, I find that they diverted a lot of resources of the local police to deport people rather than to solve crime. What we call the clearance crime rate, so the number of crimes solved relative to the one reported, actually declined at the time. As if you are directing some resources and some forces towards something which is not preventing crime, and you are therefore decreasing the number of resources which are given to actually preventing crime. So this, time and again, negative economic effect, not effect on decreasing crime, often local economy that grows lower, and of course, in all cases, great damage to the people who are deported themselves, who lose their livelihood in the U.S. And lose a lot of income. Why are we doing this over and over again? I guess because we don't study history carefully enough and we don't learn from our past.
And it seems to me that all the arguments made in favor of deportation are usually emotional, and whereas the numbers are showing a different state. That we just need to divorce ourselves from that emotional conversation and look and say, is there a benefit, or like what's really at risk here? And it doesn't sound like there's really too much of a risk, and that the net benefit is actually really good. So let me focus on that for a couple seconds. Since we've seen this historically, we clearly have healed because we became a superpower after World War II. So even though that internment was probably on the smallish side compared to what could have happened, we bounced back and we became better. Is there a time to the arc, like a predictable? So where we are now, you could plot this point based on history. Like there was a decline, then there was a lift back up in the economy. Where are we now, and how long does it take to get out the other side?
Yes. So over the U.S. history, there have been ups and downs in terms of how friendly we have been towards immigrants, for sure. So World War II, you're right that when the Japanese internment happened, and the following years were a period in which not just there was deportation, but immigration was restricted very significantly, and that continued on until the 60s. In 1965, the Nationality Act reopened the door. And so since then, in the 80s, 90s, 2000, we have had more people come in. And then I would say in the 2010s, when immigrants start again being a very important engine, a very important force, the opinion started moving towards maybe we need to close the border. Maybe there are too many. Maybe we have to deport some. In fairness, there is been this problematic phenomenon of undocumented immigrant, which are immigrants who came for economic reasons, who worked, who were hired by many companies, but they didn't have regular paper at entry. But then for 20, 25, 10 years, they have worked regularly and helped to build the American economy. So now we are in a phase in which the immigrants are a significant part of the US economy. And the opinion is again at the point that seems to say, we need to close the door. We need to send them back, and we would be better off if we did that. Without accounting for the fact that a lot of the growth in the last several decades is also because of them. And it seems there to be a cyclicality and a swing in history. Right now we are at a time as in 1929 or in 1942 when some people at least seem to favor this measure. But you're right, and I want to be very clear. While a country can choose the type and number of immigrants that they let in, and so this is a political decision. What I really object is to the economic justification that is sometimes given. In some of these measures, both deportation and other restrictive measures on immigration that are happening, there is always a bullet point that says, and this will give jobs to Americans, and this will increase the American the wages of Americans. That part, I think, is really misinformation and is really not dealing with research.
And I'll run some of the figures that I've heard as a layperson. I don't walk in the world where you are face to face with the data, but I have heard undocumented immigrants draw or really contribute about 90 to 100 billion dollars a year to the U.S. economy. And really, because they're not privy to those benefits like Social Security or healthcare or anything, they don't really drain that much on them. Is that accurate?
Yes. So again, let me rephrase a few of the numbers. Sure. So our estimates is that about 8.5 million workers have been undocumented in the recent years. That's about 4% of the U.S. labor force in general, which certainly produces in the hundreds of billions of dollars of value added. These people work at a rate which is higher than comparable American. 85% of the undocumented are employed. And keep in mind, normally they don't even have a high school degree, and they do jobs which are relatively low wage. Americans, comparable education Americans are employed at 60%, 55%. They don't receive welfare from the US. They don't qualify or unemployment insurance, but most of them pay taxes. Some use this social security number which are not right, and they pay social security. All of them pay consumption taxes when they buy things. They pay all property taxes when they rent or buy. And so they pay significantly more than they receive. So they are a net positive for the US economy, so much so that sometimes people say, oh, these people, how much does an undocumented immigrant cost to me? And the right question is how much an undocumented immigrant helps me to pay a little less taxes. Not to mention the fact that the demographic of the US is on a trajectory. Our debt is very large. Our population is projected to retire and the labor force to shrink. So that in the future, if we want to maintain the public programs such as Medicaid, such as Social Security, we need more people. And a lot of these immigrants are more people, and their children are more people because their fertility rate is a bit higher. So a lot of dimension in which really the right question is how much they contribute to the US economy.
Right. So they were never going to take from it because it's illegal for them to do so. They could not take from Medicaid. They could not take from Social Security, but they were contributing massively. And now that same number of people still need to rely on the pool that exists for Medicaid and Social Security, but no one's paying into it, or like significantly fewer people are paying into it now.
That's right. All the people we lose this way are not going to contribute in there. And I will add another little thing. As the US population is aging and people are retiring, the demand for a lot of services that are like elderly assistance, housing for the elderly, food services, personal services. A lot of those are really supplied by immigrants in the labor force. So they contribute in the fiscal system, and they provide those jobs and those services which are going to be in higher and higher demand as Americans age, and not very many young Americans are going into those type of jobs. So double whammy in terms of losing money and losing some valuable services from them.
So again, looking at history, and if we can infer anything from the episodes that we've experienced in the past, would you say that that transition from, I'm just going to mark it as what seems to be cruelty, because in the absence of any real rationale that substantiates, that would give a reason for deporting people, it just seems mean and unnecessary sometimes, a political move maybe. Do you see when the wheels turned and we accepted that we had to change our ways, that society became kinder? I mean, I look at World War II, you know, I know my father was a farmer and he benefited tremendously from the GI Bill, and he was able to provide for 7 kids and bought a house in the suburbs. You know, there were social programs that came out of that whole time that really helped people, you know, and it seemed to be born of this realization that stronger together than we are apart. Do you think there's an opportunity? Does that play out historically on the different instances that you've seen?
Yes, so I think there is a natural moment in which these sentiments are very strong and other in which they attenuate. I would say one important component in this is if the country is able to address some real problems that are really hurting some of the worker and the people of a country. So one thing, I don't want to sound like judgmental towards people who say this is a problem, this is an issue. One problem is that it's true, was true in the 29-30, was true during the Depression, and it has been true recently, that American workers who earn an average salary have been struggling. The salary have not gone up very much in the last decades, while the college educated in the top part of the distribution has done much better. Now, it's easy in these circumstances to see the problem, which is a real problem, identify a solution which is easy to coalesce people around and point at. And very often immigrants have become the scapegoat in this situation. See, you don't have a job, not because it's your fault, not because it's a problem, a complex problem of change in technology, change in unionization, change in bargaining power, but because immigrants have taken your job. So there is an easy way of coalescing the cause of the problem, and so the solution is getting them out. I think that's what generate the ingredients that generate this extreme exasperation of this type of blaming the immigrants. And then when the economy is picking up again after World War II, as you say, a lot of people benefited, the economy was going back, the sentiment went down, and people in the 60s and 70s felt that the US could absorb more immigrants because there was a growth. So sometimes is a real economic problem or social problem that, however, whose diagnosis, which is it's the immigrants' fault, is completely incorrect. But some politicians see it as the easiest way out. So in the future, we will see. I don't know. The economy in the U.S. right now is not that great, and we will see how we evolve. But I would say that maybe if we find a way of addressing some of the issue that create a problem for the American middle class, also this sentiment will become less strong.
So one of the things that I think we could take away from this is that we can't just turn back, because the global situation has changed, right? It's not like we can just say, oh, we made a mistake, we're going to stop, we're going to start, invite everybody back. Because please explain Mexico's economy to me, because that has just kind of lit up, and that's had some very that's one of the things. We can't go back to Mexico.
Yes. So one of the important thing is that the inflow of these workers who did a lot of these jobs that I was listing was coming from Mexico in the 90s and in the 2000s. And Mexico has deeply changed. Mexico has grown as an economy. It has gone through a demographic transition. So there are much fewer Mexicans who would be willing to come. In fact, immigration from Mexico since 2010 has flattened and has actually become negative. In the last 5 years, every year, we have lost about 100,000 Mexican immigrants in net. More people have gone back that they have come to the US. So Mexico is already a society that's gone through the transition in which there are not very many young people without a college education who are willing to come to the US and do these jobs. So when the US will decide to reopen and will see that there is need for people who work in food, construction, agriculture, personal services, the Mexicans will not be the people who come. Maybe for a while they will be the Central Americans who recently they have replaced, but there are a couple of reasons to make us think that even Central American immigration will not grow very much. One is that these countries are much smaller in population relative to Mexico, and they only can provide hundreds of thousands of people rather than millions and millions. And the second is that these people have to cross Mexico to come in the United States, and Mexican economy right now has become such that many of them just stop and stay in Mexico. In Mexico City, a lot of the jobs in the back of the kitchen, in service, in selling, are done by Guatemalans and El Salvadorians. We were there teaching a summer school, and this was so evident. And these people don't come to the United States. So if this type of job will be replaced by some immigrants after we have gone through this phase in which we deport them, probably they will be people coming from Africa or North Africa or the Middle East, where still the demography is such that there are more young people willing to do this travel. So the economy of the world has changed, and the US right now is just accelerating some decline of labor force in some jobs that would have happened, and the question would be who will replace these people?
Right, because as you pointed out, that people from Guatemala, Venezuela, whatever, they're making Mexico what Mexico made us, and we don't have that. Which I guess you could say, would you qualify it as unskilled labor or?
Yeah, sometimes people use this word unskilled, meaning economists say people who don't have a college education, right? These are jobs which require a lot of skill sometimes, both in agriculture, in construction. You need to really know what you're doing when you're pruning a vineyard or when you are, laying the bricks but they're applied skills in a sense, and so they don't require higher education, but they are fundamental to grow sectors in the economy, which are very important for the economy. And as you were saying, that will continue to be in high demand in the United States because we all need to eat, we all need food, we need personal services, we need hotel, we need construction, but when very few people from the country will do it. And Mexico, as you say, is going through the similar transition now, maybe still a little lagging, but in the next 20 years, very much the dynamic between Central America and Mexico can become like the one Mexico-US was 20 years ago.
And then from a United States perspective, getting that labor force here, as you said, it will likely come from like an African continent somewhere, a lot more logistically challenging than just walk across the border, welcome.
Yes, so it's in fact more likely that the world that we're going to experience in the next 20, 30 years is a world in which the US will struggle to have that type of immigration, and the natural destination for those immigrants will be Europe. So those people, both for historical ties and geographical proximity, are looking for jobs in Europe. And Europe is in the same situation as the US, is declining demographically. It has a lot of aging population in needs of these workers. So it will be harder also because there isn't potential in Europe. I have to say that the attitude of Europeans toward immigration are not much better than the US, and so in this is still an issue. Will the US continue to be an attractor and go back, or will Europe replace the US in many of this? It will depend also on their policy, on their attitude, but yes, it will be hard to divert that group towards the US.
So Mexico could be it. Mexico could be the next great superpower.
So Mexico or any country which is a little young, open, and has potential access to people. So let me say one thing. Today we talked about immigration of workers, immigration of people who are very important in these sectors. The US has been lucky and blessed by having another massive flow of immigrants, which are the high skill. They are the scientists, the technology, especially the engineers, who have flocked to the US, and they have been a massive contribution to our economy. Now, that part of the immigration may continue to go on if the US continue to be this leader in technology, science, and open to that type of immigration. I would say that that part of the immigration still sees the US. People will travel far away in the world to come to the US if they are scientists, engineers, because just the pay, just the universities, the research center, the company that hire them are so high quality, and they are leader. And so that part, which maybe we will discuss, is also a very important part of the US immigration, and that could continue, I would say, if the US maintain the leadership and doesn't do takes other policies measure. The one of attracting workers that do this manual job, I think we will have to find a way in the US, maybe to live with fewer of these workers. Technology will help a little bit, but prices of these services will go up, that's for sure. Already, all the care of the elderly, health care, which use a lot of this work, will become more expensive because it's hard to find these immigrants. And we will have to adjust to a situation in which it's not as easy to maybe build a house or have a restaurant, and the part which is more the bottleneck is really finding the right workers to do that.
So I don't want to be too globally negative around this whole thing, but I'm seeing, from what you're saying, I'm hearing this is going to take a while for us to heal from, if we heal at all. It's going to take, you said, maybe 30 years, because the people who we would have relied upon to replenish our workforce are likely not interested in coming, because they've kind of developed their own vibe, and they are attracting their own workforce that's helping them to survive. The logistics of getting others in is almost prohibitive, because there's a continental divide, and there's a pervasive a lot of other people are going to want this help as well. So we are kind of out of that. It's not as promising as it could be. In addition to that, one of the things that could save us is the fact that we are, or have traditionally been, really good at research and really good at education, and we are innovators in that space. But then we see this administration taking its aims on higher education to the point where it's calling higher education the enemy, and then says that we need to be closed down. Not a pretty picture. What's your out? Like, what words of encouragement do you offer people who are listening, who are just like, oh my God, the odds are so stacked against us right now?
The U.S. future can only be that the U.S. A successful economic future can only be there if the U.S. continue to become and be a hub for high education, innovation, human capital. That's where our comparative advantage is. That's where we have attracted people from all over the world. That's where our leadership is. The current measure, which for now are just short term, they have been changed, are compromising the competitiveness of the US. And I would say, for a vision which is very naive and incorrect, bringing back manufacturing to the US. So are we going to give up jobs and leadership in university, lab, research center for people to work in an assembly line? So this seems to be going backward. And the centers which are responsible for this innovation and growth, university, top firm, have had a lot of hurdles in their funding, accessing labor force. I would think that the strength in the US of this part of the economy and the society, and even the influence on the current administration, ought to be strong enough that at some point some of this measure needs to be kind of stepped back a little bit in order to find a more balanced approach in which some of this may go on, but we recognize how needed it is that smart people from abroad can come, that university can do their research. So my hope is that the rest of the civil society and the economy will, put a check on what, policy and politicians have done in the last year. I think there are ears which are listening to the business community, and the universities are a powerful voice in the US in aggregate, and they have stopped or limited some of these measures. I hope that this will continue, and I hope that even the US public will give a signal that we cannot lose all of that because of some very limited and ideological policies that we're taking. So my hope is that the economic, the social, the business forces will push back, and we will not really go all the way.
So I'm going to ask you a devil's advocate question here, because it seems like the government, the powers that exist in this country right now seem intent on delivering absolute power to very few wealthy people who would control industry. Do you see industry being able to step up and plug in the gap where an empowered workforce could have? Could we experience something like that? Could they take innovation and research upon themselves to deliver?
Well, I think you clearly need a balance between sort of business leader and the labor force. And you're right that now we're going into, and the US is a place where business has had a lot of power, maybe at the expense of labor, and unionization has declined the strength of workers. I think, though, that work and labor and employment has always been a crucial element of the US success. So if you look at what makes immigrants in the US so even different from immigrants who went to Europe, they all were absorbed into employment. They all worked at very high levels. So the fact that for Americans, this labor ethic and working ethic and participating to labor is so important, I think is perceived by politicians in many levels. So the need is to continue create jobs for people and good jobs for people. That has been very often what the elite or the policy have been accused of not being able to do. So you just have to rebalance a little bit and to understand that some of the policy who have been told have been sold as creating this opportunity don't. And then we need to think what are the policies that could do this. I do think that in the US there is this diffused high value of being employed, working, success in your career, success in your professionalism. That necessarily is something that the elite need to deal with, and creating more opportunity for the US workers, which my research shows is complementary with creating more opportunity for immigrants, I think eventually will be a very powerful force that hopefully rebalances things a bit.
And so we could see a return, although it might take a little bit longer. We could see a return to a kinder society, because we're kind of forced into that place where we realize that the people really are helpful. They really do drive what we do.
Yes. I always say, people accuse economists of saying, economists are people who worry about money. They think that capital is the key of the world. That's not true. There is this thing which is called human capital, that which are people, their ability, their smartness, their creativity, that in any model of economics are the key driver of country success, of growth, of ideas, of evolution. I think that you're right. There is a variety of forms in which this human capital is very important, but from the labor to the professional, I think putting this and trying to value this and trying to understand what the impact of immigrant on this, what is the impact of an immigration policy which looks at growth on this, I think that will be key, and that could be the key to really see the positive effect also of immigration.
And unfortunately, we're going to have to deal with a little bit more little bit more hurdles that are coming our way through. H-1B visa is a very deep topic. Too deep, we don't have enough time to get in today, but I would like to invite you back to walk us through that if you're up for that.
I would love to come back and talk about H-1B visas.
Okay. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. This has been very eye-opening, and I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Sincerest thanks to today's guest, Giovanni Peri. If you'd like to learn more about Giovanni and his work, check out our YouTube page for links to his bio, books, articles, research, and more. And thank you for joining Minds Over Matters today. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe, share with your friends, and spread the word. We have a lot to say, and we guarantee something for everyone. Minds Over Matters is hosted by Ed Kiggins, produced by the College of Letters and Science at UC Davis, and filmed at the Wyatt Pavilion. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.